Good morning again, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Pollinator Habitat in Practice, Case Studies from Rural Electric Cooperatives. My name is Iris Caldwell. I'm at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois Chicago, where we facilitate the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, which is a forum that provides information and best management practices and a variety of resources for energy and transportation organizations that are interested in promoting habitat on their landscapes, such as utility and transportation rights of way and other lands. In addition to webinars like these and connecting people through our online community and our working task forces, the working group also has semi-annual workshops. We had one just a couple of weeks ago, and then the next one is scheduled for February 2019 on February 20th and 21st. The workshop will be in Schaumburg, Illinois, which is just outside Chicago, and will be held in conjunction with the annual meeting of Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. We'll have more details about the upcoming meeting that we'll share soon. In the meantime, you can look for more information on our website, where we have general information about the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, as well as upcoming events, and a variety of resources. We post relevant news, best management practices, planning tools, and a variety of other resources, as I said, on this website. In a few days, there will also be a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as all the past webinars we've held as a working group, so stay tuned. As far as logistics today, all attendees are currently muted or in listen-only mode. If you're having any sort of technical or audio issues, please use the chat box and we will respond as quickly as we can. If you have any questions for the presenters during their presentations today, please type those into the chat box. We've built some time at the end of the presentations for questions, but please go ahead and submit the questions as you have them throughout the webinar and as they come to mind. And then, as I said, we'll address them at the end. And as I mentioned before, we are recording today's webinar, and we will post a recording of the webinar as well as copies of the presentations to the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website. And that'll happen probably over the next week or so. Now that we've covered these logistics items, let's turn to our topic for today. We're very pleased to have two presenters from Rural Electric Cooperatives who are going to share their perspectives on how electric cooperatives are building pollinator habitat programs into their everyday operations. Our first presenter, Brad Foss, holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Fisheries Management and Biology from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He's currently Dairyland Power Cooperative's Senior Environmental Biologist and has worked in Dairyland's Environmental Department since 1992. Brad's primary job functions include leading biological and surface water monitoring and state and federal permitting activities associated with Dairyland's generating facilities, as well as coordinating Dairyland's environmental stewardship activities. These include Dairyland's Peregrine Falcon Reestablishment Program, its Pollinator Program, and the FERC Reservoir Habitat and Recreational Improvement Program. Following Brad, we'll have Josh Young present. He is a Supervisor of Natural Resources and Environmental Communications at East Kentucky Power Cooperative, which is headquartered in Winchester, Kentucky. Josh has nearly 20 years of experience conducting project compliance-related activities associated with the USDA Rural Utility Services, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and other state and federal environmental regulations. Additionally, Josh coordinates annual project and reporting requirements for the Kentucky Excellence in Environmental Leadership Program, best management practices within rare species sites, and application of generation and transmission facility vegetation management plans. Josh holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science from Georgetown College and is federally permitted to conduct endangered bat and mussel surveys. We've asked each Brad and Josh to provide an overview of their program, some of the big successes they've seen, the lessons they've learned, and address some of the common questions that we receive about habitat and working landscapes. So with that, we'll turn things over to Brad.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. I hope that everyone can hear me okay today. I think we'll take a dive right into my presentation. I've got a number of things that I want to talk about in a relatively short amount of time. What I always like to do is kind of kick off my presentation with just giving an overview of Dairyland Power Cooperative. A lot of folks on the call maybe aren't familiar with Dairyland, and then get into the plight of the pollinators. You know, what's going on with pollinators? Why are we all of a sudden looking at establishing all of this pollinator habitat? Look at Dairyland's pollinator efforts from our landfill cap planting program to bluff prairie restoration, our solar projects, substation plots, and then get into expected costs. If you're new to the game and want to start putting in pollinator plots, what can you expect from a cost perspective on that? And then also touch on public outreach, what we're doing with that, and then wrap things up with our future plans here at Dairyland. So a little background on Dairyland Power Cooperative. We are a generation and transmission cooperative. We're headquartered in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We provide wholesale power to 24 member distribution cooperatives and 17 municipal utilities. We have a customer base of over 600,000 people. As far as our generating resources, you can see that we're quite heavy into coal. We're increasing our wind and solar makeup. Natural gas is roughly 5% of our generation, municipals 9%. Other renewables, which primarily is our Flambeau Hydro Station in northern Wisconsin, makes up about 3% of our generation. I do have listed a new facility that we're currently looking at constructing in northern Wisconsin called the Nemadji Trail Energy Center. It is a combined cycle natural gas facility. We're partnering with Minnesota Power on that. Facility is scheduled to be completed in 2025. It'll be roughly 550 megawatts, of which Dairyland would own 50%. Our service territory, which you can see on the figure on the left there, is primarily the western half of Wisconsin, southeast Minnesota, northeast Iowa, and northwest Illinois. We have roughly 3,200 miles of transmission lines and just under 300 substations. So the plight of the pollinators. Why is there such a big focus on pollinators right now, and why are companies like Dairyland really getting into establishing pollinator plots? Well, when we talk about pollinators, we're talking about your native bees, honeybees, beetles, flies, moths, butterflies, small mammals like your hummingbirds and bats. And the importance of pollinators is that worldwide, approximately 1,000 plants grown for food, beverages, fibers, spices, medicines, a number of other things need to be pollinated by insects and animals. And you can see a list there of some of the things that require pollination, and it's highly likely that there isn't anyone on the call today that goes through any day without eating or utilizing something that is derived from pollination. And we've seen a big decline in pollinators over the last few years. And there's a number of reasons that contribute to this. Probably two of the big heavy hitters would be pesticide use and, of course, habitat loss. Disease can also impact pollinators, and there could be other issues contributing to that too, such as climate change. Now, Dairyland got involved in the pollinator business a number of years ago, around 1994, and at that time it wasn't really known as pollinator plot establishment. It was more native prairie reestablishment, native prairie regeneration, and the focus was not so much on the insects but more on establishing these prairies and the plants and so forth. And in 1994, Dairyland was looking at capping a coal ash landfill that they had near our Genoa, Wisconsin coal-fired plant. It was approximately 38 acres in size, and typical protocol at that time had been to seed these landfill caps with just your garden variety road mix of vegetation. And we kind of did a little out of the box thinking and thought, well, geez, it would be really neat to, instead of using road mix, try and seed the landfill cap with the native prairie grasses and forbs. So we contacted Prairie Restorations out of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they were able to put together a site development plan for us. So in the fall of 1994, Prairie Restoration came on site. They seeded the area with grass seeds, which were drilled. Wildflower seeds were hand planted at approximately 250 seedlings per acre. And when it was all said and done, over 40 different kinds of grasses and forbs were planted on top of the landfill cap. So another thing that Prairie Restoration did, which is really important when you're looking at putting in pollinator plots, is establishing a management plan. Typically, your pollinator plots will take 3 to 5 years to develop. So Prairie Restoration had put together a 10-year management plan for us, and the plan included rotational mowing, controlled burns, spot spraying, and weed whipping of nuisance species. And we really tried to incorporate the community into our efforts at Genoa. The mowing that we had done was contracted out to local farmers. This worked out really well because when the mowing of the prairie needed to be done, it was typically past the planting season for farmers, but yet it was before the harvest season, so it was kind of in their lag time, so to speak. And we also did a number of controlled burns at the site, and we coordinated those burns with the local chapter of the Prairie Enthusiasts. And to this day, on an annual basis, we still have Prairie Restoration staff coming out to make 1 to 2 site visits per year to combat nuisance species. Another thing, kind of a neat project that we've been involved in the last few years is near our Elma, Wisconsin coal ash landfill site. Back in 2008, we had enrolled 110 acres of bluffland property into a conservation easement with the Mississippi Valley Conservancy. And within that 110 acre plot, there was roughly a 7 to 8 acre bluff prairie, or as they're known around this area, goat prairies. And if you've ever been up the Mississippi Valley between Wisconsin and Minnesota, you're familiar with the bluffs, and you see these steep prairies up on the bluffs, and that's why they're called goat prairies, because of the terrain. They're so steep that really, goats are probably the only animal that can successfully traverse the prairies. And so we've worked with the Mississippi Valley Conservancy and their volunteers on nuisance species removal, which for this particular site has been a lot of red cedar removal, and also done some controlled burns up there. Some of the issues we've run into with this particular site is the challenging terrain. I mentioned the steepness, and it's really hard to get volunteers a lot of times to come out and work on that steep slope. So we did look at having consulting firms come in and do some of the work, and we found that it can be very expensive to have the firms come in and work at a site of this nature. And the feeling I got was that there were a lot of companies that came out and looked at it. They would send us a proposal, and they actually bid themselves out of the job because they just weren't real interested in working on that tough terrain. But the neat thing about this site is that we don't have to do any new plantings. The site is already ecologically diverse, and really what we're doing with the burning and removing the invasives is we're stimulating that dormant seed bed that's been there for years and years. So really kind of a fun project. Now, probably the projects that Dairyland has been, I guess, getting the most publicity out of in recent years are solar projects. Dairyland has an agreement with CMS Energy and ENGIE to purchase 25 megawatts of energy from 18 different solar projects located throughout Dairyland service territory. And as with our other projects, we're working with Prairie Restorations on this. Prairie Restoration staff has designed, install, and maintain the native prairie seed mixes. They make sure that they're especially suited to the specific geographic location of the site and also to the site conditions, as you can have variation just within the site itself, maybe wetter and drier soils, depending on where you are at the site. Prairie Restoration will come in and they'll mow, spray, do any reseeding that's necessary, and remove weeds 2 to 3 times a year at each of these sites. And when everything is complete by the end of 2018 here, these solar sites will have made roughly 250 acres of new pollinator habitat. So what are some of the benefits that we're seeing at these solar projects? Probably the obvious one is we're providing beneficial pollinator habitat for the insects and the small mammals. The sites also prevent stormwater runoff, allowing water to flow back into or infiltrate back into the soil. And I think too that with these sites, when you come to the public proposing a new generation site, I think it goes a long ways if you can have a project tied to it with environmental benefit, such as a pollinator plot. And I think this may also come into play down the road as far as aiding and permitting, because I think the agencies will look a lot on these projects like the public will. Yeah, it's a generation project, but boy, there's a pollinator plot that's going to be tied to it that's really going to bring a lot of benefit to the environment. And of course, ultimately, I think it will reduce the long-term maintenance costs at the sites. Typically, if we didn't have these pollinator sites, we would have to be coming in and probably mowing to knock the grasses down if not every 2 weeks, every maybe 2 to 3 weeks, just to try and keep things in check. So, initially, of course, you're going to have a little higher expense with the installation of the pollinator plot and your initial maintenance, but those costs should taper off after probably 3 or 4 years. Now, another area that we've kind of ventured into recently is looking at our substations. Dairyland has, as I mentioned, nearly 300 substations, and typically when we go to construct or purchase land for a substation, we'll buy some additional property that kind of acts as a buffer around the substation. So in 2017, we started investigating potential sites for pollinator plot development, and the 2 photos that you see on this slide here are 2 sites that we developed earlier this year, but they were identified in 2017. And with that, we were looking for high-profile sites that were located next to subdivisions or development. Reason being for that is that we want people to know about the plight of the pollinators, and we also want people to know what Dairyland is doing, that we're trying to do something positive for the environment by putting in these pollinator plots. And we also look for sites that are in close proximity to one another. From a cost perspective, it's much easier to have a group like Prairie Restoration come in and seed and conduct maintenance on 2 or 3 sites that are located maybe within 30 miles of one another, as opposed to having one site in northeast Iowa and another site up in northwest Wisconsin. So we prepped the 2 sites for planting in 2017. 2018, we seeded these 2 sites in June, and then we also identified an additional site over in Minnesota, which was prepped and seeded the same year. I have up there erect signage at each site. That's something that we didn't get done this year, but it's definitely in the cards for next year. We want to make sure that we have signage out there, so when people come to these sites, they know what's going on with pollinators and why we're putting in these pollinator sites. And the site that we just developed over in Minnesota, that one is actually adjacent to a park. So our plan for that one is to kind of cut in an interpretive trail through the pollinator plot that will connect with the park and have some informational kiosks set up for it to provide education for folks walking on the trail. One of the big questions that I get, of course, is, hey, how much, this is great, but how much does it cost? Well, cost is highly variable with this. It depends a lot on the size of the site. Typically, the bigger the site that you have, granted it'll be more expensive, but your per acre cost will likely be a little bit less than a smaller site. The number of sites, as with business in general, if you can give a company like Prairie Restoration more business, they're probably going to give you a little better price. Travel time, location of the sites, this kind of circles back to my previous point where if you can have a number of sites maybe in a smaller area, it's going to cost less for Prairie Restoration to come in and maintain those sites because their travel time is going to be a lot less than going to sites all over the service territory. Seeding versus plugs. Seeding site, relatively cheap. If you want to put plugs in, which are plants that are already developed, maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, those cost a little bit more. So to prep and seed a site, Dairyland's experience has been, and I know these confidence intervals are quite large here, but to prep and seed has been running roughly $2,200 to $3,500 an acre. So for a 2-acre site, you're looking at $4,400 to $7,000 to prep and seed. Now, we haven't really done any sites where we just prepped and seed because, again, the key is really the follow-up maintenance. These plots take 3 to 5 years to develop, so we always want to have a maintenance plan associated with our proposal. So for prepping, seeding, and a 4-year maintenance plan, our costs have typically been running between $2,500 to $5,500 an acre. So a 2-acre site, prep, seed, and maintain for 4 years, you're going to be looking at roughly $5,000 to $11,000. Now, a big part of our program too is public outreach. Some of the things that we've done at Dairyland is we've handed out seed packets. We've distributed them on Earth Day a couple of different times and also at our cooperative annual meeting. The one knock I hear on seed packets is it doesn't guarantee planting, so you can't really take credit for it, which is true. But I think the value in seed packets is that it does raise awareness. If we can give out seed packets and it prompts folks to go home, jump on the internet and Google and look up, well, geez, why did I get, this seed packet here? And they start delving into pollinators. You've educated that person, and that's worth a lot right there. Just spreading that education. We've also handed out a number of fact sheets to adjacent landowners to our sites. Personal communication with municipalities and landowners. We've been really proactive with that. We like to involve local groups in the management of our plots. Again, the prairie enthusiasts and nature conservancies, our member co-ops, and of course schools. Anytime that you can involve a school group in these programs, it's really a good thing from a PR standpoint. One thing we did this year for the first time is we participated as a company in Pollinator Week, which occurred from June 18th to June 22nd. We had set up a week-long educational display at our corporate headquarters. Picture of the display is in the upper right there. And we handed out pollinator fact sheets. We also had a number of grab bags, which you see on the left there, handed out 500 of those. And they contained a little pollinator seed packet, a bottle of honey, and then an informational card on pollinators. We also had informational boards set up on Dairyland's pollinator efforts. And we had a keynote speaker come in to give a presentation on what folks can do in their own backyard to try and help out pollinators. So that went over really well. Our communications department was active on social media. We had 3 different Facebook posts with what we were doing. We had over 240 likes on that, and we also had a few tweets that were sent out as well. So it kind of brings me to the tail end of my presentation here as far as our future plans at Dairyland. What we really want to do is continue to maintain and enhance our existing projects. That's really important. One thing I've seen with pollinator plots is that it's really easy to overextend yourself. There's a lot of opportunity to go out there and plant seed, but the key, as I mentioned before, is really the maintenance. So you don't want to go out, seed a number of sites, and then all of a sudden find out that you just don't have the means to maintain the site. So the best advice I would give there is be to start slow and gradually increase your activities. We also want to investigate new opportunities, whether that be solar. We're also looking at our old landfill caps that were seeded with the road mix, possibly tilling those caps up and reseeding them with pollinator mixes. Our substation program, we want to keep going with that. Rights-of-ways. Now, that's something that Dairyland hasn't really gotten into. I know that a lot of other utilities have gone that route. Right now, Dairyland has just worked on properties that we own. We have not really done any work on properties that we have easements with. And then, of course, we want to continue with our public outreach and education, both internally and externally. So with that, I would typically take questions, but I think we're going to hold questions until the end. So just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to present today.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. And yes, this is a good reminder. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make on Brad's presentation, type them into the chat box, and we'll save them for the end. But next, let's turn things over to Josh to talk about East Kentucky Power's projects.
All right, thank you, Iris. And I guess just to get started while we're transitioning to programs there, again, my name is Josh Young. I'm with East Kentucky Power Cooperative, Supervisor of Natural Resources and Environmental Communications. And the presentation today is going to focus on we're kind of new to the pollinator game. So this was our initial effort in establishment of monarch and pollinator habitat, and really want to focus on kind of some lessons learned throughout the process, things that we'll do differently. We've got a couple, we actually have 3 sites we're planning for 2018 establishment, and just focus on kind of those lessons learned and some things that we will do differently moving forward.
Josh, you might want to try clicking on the slide first and see if that helps.
All right. There we go. Thank you. So kind of the driver for our program here in Kentucky is the Kentucky Excellence in Environmental Leadership, or Kentucky Excel. And this is a Department of Environmental Protection program that we've been a partner level member since 2009. And this is it's a voluntary program that provides, it's really a great opportunity for East Kentucky Power to have these environmental stewardship type projects. In this case, focusing on pollinators, but we've done peregrine falcons, we've done barn owl nest boxes, we've done native grass plantings, we've produced bats of Kentucky poster. So various opportunities there, but really focused on environmental stewardship. And these projects might not otherwise be available for or an opportunity for us, but there are benefits, and the big one there to focus on is the marketing opportunities. And I think Brad mentioned that, but we don't always get the best press, so it's always awesome to be able to get out there and show the good things that we're doing. We actually, a couple weeks ago, we did at our Spurlock station, which is located on the Ohio River. We had an Ohio River sweep. We did a cleanup with the Living Lands and Waters folks, and we had a big full page print, lots of photos in the local paper there, and just a great opportunity through this Kentucky Excel program to do those types of projects and get credit for those things. But like I said, today's going to focus on our establishment of monarch way station and native pollinator habitat at our headquarters facility located in Winchester, Kentucky. And another driver for this is we've just established actually finished. This is our Cooperative Solar Farm 1 located on the north side of our headquarters facility. It's about a 60-acre facility that went online in the fall of 2017, so it's been online about 1 year. But one of the focuses for this, through our marketing and outreach group, they've really focused on tours, and we've actually had a lot of tours. But this is the viewing station that's been established, and you can see in the background there the solar panels, and it's kind of these kiosks that they've established here. And I think we can let's see, get the laser pointer here and kind of highlight, obviously the solar panels here in the background, but these kiosks are something that I wanted to point out because this is really where we focused. The areas adjacent to the solar site, we've really focused on kind of our environmental outreach or environmental stewardship type activities. And you can see, in the legend here, we've got the panels and the inverters, but beehives, that's been one thing, and we'll talk about that. I got a slide on that here at the end, but we have beehives that have been established. We've got 4 hives here. You can see one of them there just behind the viewing station. Our pollinator plantings, which is what we're going to talk about today, but then our pollinator condo is back over here. You can see that there in the background. And again, I have a slide on that, but we had to get a core permit for this project, and we had some wetland avoidances, so those are also called out on the kiosk there. But just jumping in with our monarch way station and native pollinator habitat. Like I said, we're pretty new to this. This was our first effort in establishing a pollinator habitat, and our real focus was on the visual appeal. So we're kind of focused on having the tour groups or the outreach, working with our marketing folks, but also the monarch habitat. Monarchs are under evaluation for listing by U.S. Fish and Wildlife as endangered species, and the potential implications there are pretty significant. So that was a main focus of what we were trying to do here. So you can kind of see here on the map, our native pollinator habitat was this blue area, 0.7 acres that we were looking at. So you can see that highlighted in blue. Our native wildlife habitat, just focus on native habitat, grasses primarily. That's the highlighted in green. And then the red areas were our pollinator, what we focused on the monarch habitat, and that was milkweed and pollinator plugs that we were looking to establish in those areas. A couple of things I would also point out here. This 0.0, this small little area here on the upper end of our pollinator plot, I think this actually turned out to be our best, our most successful portion of our plantings, and I'll focus on why that was here in a minute. But for the next slide, the next slide here was taken from this location. So just kind of for reference here, you can see this area at the base of the hill. This is our pollinator habitat with our 30 species seed mix focused on wildflowers, and this goes around up the hill here to the right. Our milkweed area, our monarch way station focus, was this area in the lower portion of the field here, and then on the other side over here, this is our wildlife habitat, which again was focused primarily on native grasses. So just jumping in, I mentioned lessons learned is kind of what we're looking to focus on here. Site preparation is critical. So, working with our consultant that we utilize, Roundstone Native Seed, weed control is #1 priority. You can see on the picture to the left, this was prior to any site development. Primarily fescue-dominated field. You can see some chicories and some Queen Anne's lace, and just primarily exotics there. So eliminating those exotic weedy species was critical, and that was priority #1. And this is why I called it lesson learned #1, because we did not do a very good job at this, I'm afraid. So, what the goal is to kind of develop a clean slate. You want to get rid of these exotics. you want to have a depleted seed bank, and that's going to take multiple herbicide applications across several seasons. So, and I've got some a schedule slide here in just a minute, but really focusing on knocking back in an initial treatment to knock back the vegetation that's there and see what you get, your regrowth, and then targeting whatever you have that's coming back. And like I said, cool season applications, warm season applications, definitely critical in developing that clean slate so that you can, you're not going to have those competition issues with your plantings that you're looking to establish. So with our plantings, we had the two applications. The seed planting, we used a drill for this. We went with native locally adapted seeds, and like I mentioned, Roundstone Native Seed was our consultant that we utilized. You know, the big reason for going with the drill is just the increased germination rates. You know, up to 25% increased germination as opposed to broadcasting. So we chose to go with drilling seeds in. And actually, this is a good example of we kind of got delayed, and we had our last herbicide application was delayed, and you can see the seeds were going in, and we still had a pretty at least in this particular area, a pretty good cover of clovers and fescues and dandelions and just some various other weedy type things. So just a great example there of kind of some of the issues that we faced. So something that might seem pretty basic, water is important for growing plants. Not necessarily as important for the seed growth. You know, these native seeds are going to outcompete a lot of the weedy stuff. They can germinate with minimal water, and even even just dew can help them get going. But for the plugs, water is definitely critical. And like I said, we got delayed a bit and kind of got ahead of ourselves, I think, looking back on it now. But our seeds went in the ground on June 30th. Our plugs didn't go in the ground until July 10th. And as it would be, forecast for the next 10 days beyond that point was 90 degrees and not 0% chance of rain. So we were out with water hoses and water trucks and just trying to get those plugs going to where they would get established and be able to make it through this kind of that little mini drought that we experienced. But I guess kind of the lesson learned there is planning ahead is critical. If you're planning on plugs, especially getting those in the ground much earlier in the year when you're going to, you would expect to have a higher % chance of rain, can be something that save you, watering 2 acres with a garden hose. That was an effort. So talking about scheduling here, and noting that there are significant regional, north to south, but also yearly variations. This is highly dependent on the rain and the temperatures. If you get a warm, rainy spring, you're going to have a much earlier growing season. But just based on what we saw, herbicide application in the fall before the end of the growing season, just kind of to clean the slate, like we talked about, develop that base layer. And then coming back with an early spring application to target your cool season stuff, your winter annuals, following the green up, and then waiting approximately 6 weeks till you get 4 to 6 inches of regrowth and hitting it again with another herbicide application. And then really talking to our consultant, he said, ideally you would wait another 6 weeks till you get another 4 to 6 inches of regrowth and hit it again. He said he really likes two attempts at the cool season stuff and 2 attempts at the warm season stuff. So, but they are very focused on getting that seed bank depleted and really working with a clean slate. So just jumping into some pictures here. One of our native pollinator habitat. So the area that was focused on having color, being a showy part of these tours. This was hugely successful. And, one of the things that we asked for was color throughout the growing season. And this is a picture in this is in May. See a couple others here, but May, June timeframe. This was 2018. So these seeds went in the ground in June of 2017. So this is our first growth, our first season. Butterfly milkweed, you've got the coreopsis there on the right. Purple coneflowers were starting to come in. And one note here, you notice the coreopsis here in May and June, almost a blanket of yellow. as we moved into July, the Coreopsis, it had gone through its cycle, it's seeded out, but that was replaced by black-eyed Susans. And then this was kind of our peak time, our July time frame, you know, the bergamots, the Illinois bundle flowers, the purple coneflowers, yellow or gray-headed coneflowers, just kind of a lot of color, a lot of pop there. And like I said, this was a very successful, even carried us into the August and September time frame, our fall wildflowers, the New England asters, the swamp milkweeds, the partridge pea. So I think this was very successful. Our native wildlife habitat, while I think we're calling this lesson learned number 4, while it was a successful planning, it was apparently so unimpressive that we failed to take even one photo. So pretty ironic that we have hundreds, maybe thousands of pictures of our pollinator habitat and our milkweed, but we didn't have one picture of our wildlife habitat. And I mean, it just kind of is what it is. It's not showy. It's just native grasses, and you're not going to have that color, that pop. So just a consideration that while it does serve a purpose for, you know, small mammals and birds, and, you know, nesting areas, and it's very important. You're not going to have that, you know, that pop or that eye-catching appeal there with the wildlife habitat. So our monarch habitat, this, you know, kind of focused on monarch way station or just general habitat. And like I said, I'm kind of new to this, so one of the big things here was we went with plugs. I kind of pointed out that small area on the top side of our pollinator habitat. That's the picture in the top right. That area was seeded with our pollinator mix, but then we came back on top of that and put milkweed plugs in that area. And I think that was hugely successful, because you not only had the pollinator, the flowers as a food source, but you also had the food plant for the monarch caterpillar. So very successful in that upper portion. The picture to the bottom right here, where you can see the folks, this area here is that lower portion of the field. This was our monarch habitat. This is where the plugs were put in. And what we saw here is, while we had a lot of milkweed growth, we also had a lot of weedy growth. So you can see the common milkweed there in the front, main, you know, central portion of the picture here. But you also have swamp milkweed over here, but a lot of weeds. And the way these plugs, the way we went with putting these plugs in the ground is basically every square foot a plug went in, and that left a lot of bare soil areas where you've got this a lot of competition coming in there from fescues, and even a mulberry there in the right portion of the picture, and thistles, and a lot of this stuff I don't know what it is, but you can see the date there. That was September of 2017. So, you know, these went in the ground in July. So we obviously had a good establishment of milkweed, but we also had some weedy issues there, and I think part of that goes back to just not getting a good clean slate with our herbicide and our site development or site preparation, but then also just kind of the means in which the milkweeds are put in the ground, leaving that a lot of open ground there, which allow for those weeds to come in. So like Brad mentioned, we're going to have some maintenance in this area to address this weed issue, whether that's kind of doing a mowing cycle, or burning is ideal, but this site is probably not going to get burned just due to the location at our headquarters here. But maybe some spot herbicide applications, or some toppings, or some different things we're going to have to do to get these weeds back under control this year, upcoming, in 2019. One of the other things, and I'm calling this lesson learned number 6, but mowing milkweed. And, before we started this project, I would have thought this was probably not a great idea. Obviously, if you're mowing your milkweed, you're not going to have it there for monarchs. But, and this is actually a picture of my daughter here. She did a science fair experiment with monarch caterpillars and food plants. But you can see the date there, August 26, 2018. So that was just this past late summer. And what had happened here is, this is adjacent to our monarch habitat. And this area had gotten mowed in June. And there was quite a bit of milkweed here, and I was kind of devastated that it had gotten mowed down, but it actually turned out, I think, to be a blessing, because you've got this regrowth coming in, and you can see that one she's got a hold of there has flowers on it. So in late August into September, we have fresh regrowth. You can see a photo there, October 19th, monarch caterpillars out feeding. So these late fourth generation monarchs, this could be critical, and and having a food source there for them, especially for the caterpillars. And I think moving forward, at least portions of our areas that have milkweed, we're going to look to mow those areas in the early June timeframe, to where we have this regrowth in the late season as a food source for these third and fourth generation monarchs. And like Brad said, financial considerations are always huge. Our total project cost was roughly $25,000, but you can see there 70% of that was our monarch habitat. The plugs were expensive. 17% towards the pollinator habitat and 13% for our wildlife habitat. Moving forward, I mentioned we've got 3 sites we're going to do in 2019, and our cost estimates for budgetary purposes are going to be approximately $5,000 per acre. And that's going to be, I think the way we're going to look at doing those is a pollinator habitat mix, that 25 to 30 seed mix there, and then putting some milkweed plugs, scatter those out throughout that area on a much smaller scale. So bring that cost way down, but also get, the pollinator food source and the milkweed food source. And Brad mentioned that, but the larger the area, you're going to decrease your per acre cost, and you use mobilization equipment fees. And then, once you get these established, your maintenance cost is really minimal. And that's kind of been a selling point for our folks here is, they're having to mow these areas multiple times, a couple times, once a week, a couple times a month. Getting these established, once you get these areas established, you have very minimal maintenance costs. So that's been kind of a selling point. And then just kind of a couple of the other Kentucky Excel projects at our headquarters here. I mentioned the honeybees. We've got Troy and Eddie are beekeepers that are on staff here. They've established 4 honeybee hives, and you can see the cooperative solar honey bear there. That they harvested the honey, and that's been a huge hit. But lesson learned here is, if you're taking this picture and you don't have one of those suits on, this is way too close. Took several stings to the back of the head on this one. So just for consideration, that bees are not happy if you're stealing their honey. So, so this has been a huge success. Again, a Kentucky Excel project. And our Kentucky Excel project for this year was our pollinator condo. And lucky enough to have a master carpenter basically on staff here. He created this pollinator condo, which from the overlook you can see that it's right down adjacent to the solar facility. And the focus here is our native pollinators. They're the mason bees, the leaf cutters, the wood bees. Those native pollinators are going to utilize these crevices for nesting and the solitary nature. So, and we were able to incorporate several items from different facilities. You can see the insulators and the old work boots down, and highlight those here. Some old work boots, old lineman boots, some old tools from our generating facilities. But then you see all these holes, and then the bamboo around the center here. This is focused on our native pollinators. And then just in closing here, if you build it, they will come. I don't know what my expectations were really, but I was shocked at the amount of insects that were out there especially in our pollinator habitat, and in the monarchs as well. There were caterpillars from July to September, October, and there were butterflies constantly. You can see the viceroy there, and a lot of stuff. Don't really know exactly what a lot of these were, but it's just an incredible diversity of insects that were drawn to that pollinator habitat. So with that, that's the last slide. And I don't know if we have a couple of minutes for questions here, but
We sure do. Great. Yep. Thank you, Josh. So yes, we have a couple of questions that have been typed into the question chat box. If you have others, please feel free to still submit questions. But we'll get started with a couple of the questions that we've received so far. The first one, Brad, had to do with the project that you described at the coal ash landfill. Can you describe how you keep the height of the vegetation low enough for inspections, but high enough to support the forbs?
Sure, I can go into that a little bit. We haven't we haven't done a lot of mowing at that particular site once the prairie got established. We haven't really run into any issues with inspections as far as identifying small mammal holes or anything like that. One of the things that really helps, and you can really get a thorough inspection, is if you burn the site. We burned 2 of our landfill caps last year, and boy, that's a really opportune time to get out there and do a thorough inspection, because everything is gone at that point. So that's probably your best bet to do that. And if you can just kind of do your routine maintenance and then throw in a prescribed burn maybe every 2 or 3 years, that's kind of the protocol that we've been using for our inspections. So the taller grass hasn't really been a hindrance to us, I would say.
Okay, great. On the topic of maintenance, can you describe some of the maintenance challenges you faced for some of the solar sites? Any feedback you received, for instance, from adjacent landowners, or concerns about spreading weeds beyond the site?
Yeah, I guess, with those projects being relatively new, we haven't run into any maintenance issues, so to speak, so far. As far as, some of the plants migrating off-site to adjacent properties or anything, we haven't heard that concern from landowners. So I guess we haven't had to address that at all. I can't really, I guess, give a lot more background on that. That might be something as the sites develop another 2 or 3 years when they get more mature, if we start running into maybe some maintenance issues or whatnot, I could better address it. I know a lot of the plants that we have put in around the solar projects, they are, pollinator plants that only grow to a certain height. They're not the real tall grasses or forbs. Just from a maintenance standpoint, so we don't have to get in there and mow so frequently.
A couple of audience members noted that you had a picture of sheep at the solar site. So we're curious if you were using grazing at any of the sites.
We have used sheep at a couple of the sites, yes. And then we're also around the area of Wisconsin where we live. There's also a company that raises goats for the same purpose, where they will come in and they will fence off an area and they will introduce a number of goats as kind of a vegetation control as well. We haven't done that yet, but we have investigated it. So there are, some non-mechanical bio-control methods that are out there that we're looking at.
Okay, great. A question for both of you. Are any of your areas that you're using native vegetation, are they considered urban? And has that been a consideration?
I guess I can take a shot at that. With our substation plots that we're putting in, actually, the last 3 that we put in within the last year, I would say are all in urban settings. One of them butts up against a park, which has homes around it. The other 2 are located near subdivisions, right next to subdivisions. We haven't really run into any pushback from the landowners on that. Again, that kind of, I had mentioned that we were actually looking for sites like that, where we could kind of get the word out about pollinators and what Dairyland is doing to help pollinators, kind of an education aspect of it. The only maintenance drawback that we may see at those sites is I don't know if we'll be able to conduct controlled burns at a couple of the sites. One of them, actually next to the park, we burned that earlier this year, and there were no concerns at all. But that's kind of what we're looking for, are those high-profile sites where we do have homes around and so forth, and that's why we've really had to beef up our outreach program, going out and talking with the individual homeowners whose property butts up against where the pollinator plot will, be developed. We've met with the town boards, given presentations to make sure that we have buy-in from them as well. And that was one of the things that the town boards really requested when we went out and talked to them and said, we're looking at developing this area into a pollinator plot. Is they really wanted to see the commitment, and by that I mean they wanted to see a management plan, 3, 4, 5-year management plan, that we weren't just going to go out there and put a bunch of pollinator seeds out there as a way to get away from mowing or whatnot. They wanted to show commitment on our part. So, I guess that would be something to think about if you're looking at these areas. Be prepared to, when you go and talk to the municipalities and so forth, and the different subdivisions and landowner groups, have a management plan in hand, because that's what folks really want to see.
Right. Okay. Josh, do you have anything to add about urban sites?
No, I don't. Our headquarters here is a fairly rural agricultural area, and just the nature of our cooperative itself, we're in the rural parts of Kentucky, so we've not had a lot of urban considerations. I did see a question here regarding looking at planning the mixes inside the solar facility, and I guess, is that a question we could address?
Yeah, please go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that is something that I did want to point out, is that we definitely did evaluate planning the pollinator mixes within the footprint of the solar facility, and ultimately the leadership and did cost analysis and determined that they wanted to have the footprint, just a clean area there. So we really are focusing on just kind of the adjacent areas to the solar facility.
There was another question for you, Josh.
Dairyland, with the solar fields, is that people are really interested in what you're planting. We've had a few requests for the seed mixes that we've been using at the various solar sites, and we've been able to get that information from Prairie Restoration. I'm not sure if other people are maybe looking to duplicate it, that may live in that area, or are just kind of curious what they can expect to see at the solar field. So I think that's something that is going to become more popular. Our requests from the public to see what exactly you're planting, what seed mix are you using at this particular site for your pollinator plots.
Great. Josh, could you also address, we have a question about drill seeding and whether or not that could achieve a 70% coverage to meet erosion control requirements?
Yeah, it definitely would be helpful. From our stormwater control study, we have to achieve 70% for our stormwater permitting as well. But from what we saw here, it is, and it's more of a controlled site. It's not a construction site, so I'm not entirely sure if that's where this question was leading. But from what we saw here at our headquarters, 70% vegetative cover would have been established definitely. I know in construction sites that may be a little bit more difficult, but as opposed to broadcasting, we have those issues as well. And just broadcasting seed out, it does become difficult to get that 70% coverage. But yeah, in this instance, drilling the seed in was very successful. But you're kind of dealing with more like a no-till situation. It's not a construction site, so I guess that's part of the consideration there.
One of the things maybe on that too is that, not just drilling, but going with the seed plugs. Josh, it sounded like you guys had done some of that. If you really want to jumpstart your site, that's a good way to do it. While the cost is a little more expensive, you're putting out, plants that have a little more maturity. They may be 6 to 8 inches tall, and so that first year when you do seed that and put in seed plugs like that, you may actually get some color. And if you're doing it, in a higher profile area or next to developments or whatnot, people can kind of see results a little bit quicker, because I know they get a little bit antsy. Everybody wants to see things in the flowers right away, and with direct seeding, you don't get that for a few years. But if you are able to spend the extra money on plugs, that has a lot of benefit as well.
Great. Well, I think we're at time here. So I want to thank again Brad and Josh for your presentations today. You can see we've provided their email addresses there as well if you have some follow-up questions. And again, I think this was a really informative couple of case studies. So really appreciate the practical information that you shared and overall the great perspectives that you provided. So thank you again, Brad and Josh. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. And stay tuned. We'll be sending out a link to the webinar recording and their postings for the presentation. So thanks again. Have a great day.